Step onto the wrong patch of Australian dirt without permission, and you're not looking at a fine, you're looking at up to 7 years in a federal prison, under a law originally written for treason and espionage. Somewhere else in the outback, the ground itself still carries plutonium contamination that scientists estimate could remain hazardous for hundreds of thousands of years. And off the northern coast, there's a strip of sand where simply dropping an anchor without written government permission is a criminal offence because of what might still be buried beneath it, unexploded and waiting. These aren't legends. They're documented in Australian legislation, government reports and court records. Across this continent, there are at least 5 places where the government has decided ordinary people simply cannot go, not for a day, not for an hour, not without written approval from Canberra itself. Today, we're visiting all 5. If you're new here, welcome to Hidden Origins, where we dig into the geography, science, and hidden history of Australia, the stories behind the landscape most people never hear. If forbidden zones and government secrecy interest you, hit subscribe now, because we're about to go somewhere most Australians will never set foot in their entire lives. Before we go further, it helps to understand what banned actually means in Australia, because it isn't one law, it's several, stacked on top of each other for very different reasons. Some places are restricted under defence law, guarding secrets of national security. Some are restricted under environmental law, protecting land poisoned by decisions made decades ago. And some are restricted simply because the ground itself can still kill you, in the form of a weapon that never went off. Our first stop is Pine Gap, a fenced compound of white radomes sitting in the Red Desert about 20 kilometres southwest of Alice Springs, close to the geographic centre of the country. From there we travel south to the Woomera Prohibited Area in remote South Australia, an expanse of arid scrubland and salt lake roughly the size of England, sealed off since the late 1940s. Inside that same restricted zone sits our third location, Maralinga, a flat wind-scoured stretch of desert where the ground itself was rearranged by nuclear fire. Our fourth stop takes us off the mainland entirely, to the Montebello Islands, a scatter of low limestone islands off the Pilbara coast of Western Australia, surrounded by turquoise water and coral reef. Unlike our other stops, most of this marine park is actually open to fishers and campers today, except for a handful of specific patches, sealed off for a very particular reason we'll get to. And our final location sits further north still, closer to Indonesia than to Australia's own coastline, Cartier Island, an unvegetated sand cay in the Timor Sea, barely visible above the water at high tide. 5 places. 5 different legal reasons for exclusion. A spy base, a weapons range, a nuclear graveyard, a set of irradiated islands, and a minefield disguised as a sandbank. What connects them isn't geography, it's the fact that in every case, ordinary Australians were pushed out of a piece of their own country, and in most cases never fully let back in. Long before any of these places had a checkpoint or a fence, they had custodians. The land Pine Gap sits on belongs to the Arunti people, who have lived in and around Central Australia for tens of thousands of years, reading the desert through songlines, waterholes, and stories passed down long before any surveyor drew a boundary on a map. When the facility was built in the late 1960s, that history didn't disappear, it simply stopped being consulted. Decades later, protesters who walked onto the base would describe it, in open court, as stolen land. Further south, the Woomera Prohibited Area overlaps the traditional lands of at least 6 Aboriginal groups, including the Maralinga Tjarutja, the Anangu Pitjantjatjara Yankunytjatjara, the Kokatha, and the Arabana peoples. Some of these groups now legally hold portions of that land again, under native title, but only after nearly 80 years of exclusion that began the moment the British and Australian governments declared the area a weapons range in 1947. Nowhere is that history heavier than at Maralinga itself. This was Anangu land, home to the Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara peoples, who had moved across this desert for tens of thousands of years, following routes and waterholes their ancestors had used since long before recorded memory. In the 1950s, government patrol officers were sent out to clear the area of its traditional owners before nuclear testing began. Many were relocated hundreds of kilometres away to a mission at Yalata and told they could not return home. Sacred sites were fenced off, hunting grounds vanished behind checkpoints, and as we're about to see, not everyone was located in time. The Montebello Islands and Cartier Island carry a different history, not of removal, but of use by people who came from the sea rather than the desert. For generations, fishermen sailing from what is now Indonesia travelled south to harvest turtles, shells and sea cucumber from these reefs, a tradition old enough that Australia still formally recognises limited traditional fishing rights around Cartier Island today, under an agreement signed with Indonesia in 1974. In every case, long before a single fence went up. Someone already called this place home. So what actually happened at these places? Let's walk through the record, in the order it happened rather than the order we visited. 1888, the wreck of the Anne Millicent. Long before Cartier Island became a bombing range, an iron-hulled trading ship struck the reef here and went down. A wreck believed to be hers is still visible today at low tide, a rusted reminder that this stretch of the Timor Sea has always been dangerous, government warning or not. 1953 to 1957, the human cost of the British nuclear program, carried out at Emu Field and Maralinga, both inside the Woomera Prohibited Area. In 1953, a 10-year-old Yankunytjatjara boy named Yami Lester watched a black mist roll across the desert after a detonation. Within hours, his community was vomiting, breaking out in rashes, and losing their sight. Yami himself was permanently blinded. He spent the rest of his life demanding the world acknowledge what had happened. Testimony that eventually helped trigger a royal commission in 1985. Then, in 1957, military patrol officers driving through the restricted zone at Maralinga found an Aboriginal family, the Milpuddies, camped inside the fallout zone of a recently detonated bomb, despite official assurances that every traditional owner had already been cleared. The incident was kept out of public record for nearly 30 years, referred to internally only by a code name, the Pom Pom incident. While that story was unfolding in the desert, an ocean away, Britain detonated its second nuclear device at the Montebello Islands in 1956 under the code name Operation Mosaic. The blast, on Alpha Island, turned out significantly larger than its own scientists had predicted, and remains the most powerful nuclear explosion ever carried out on Australian soil. Fallout reportedly reached the mainland, far beyond the zone anyone had planned for, and in 2016, the Pine Gap Pilgrims. In the early hours of one morning in 2016, 6 activists, among them a musician carrying a viola, crossed the outer boundary of Pine Gap on foot. They were arrested within sight of the base's satellite dishes and prosecuted under a Cold War-era law normally reserved for treason and espionage. A judge ultimately handed down fines rather than prison time. But the case confirmed something unsettling. The maximum penalty for simply walking onto this land is still 7 years behind bars. 4 accounts, more than a century apart, all of them documented and all of them pointing to the same uncomfortable truth. These places were never dangerous because of legend. They were dangerous because of decisions made in government offices, thousands of kilometres away. Now, if you're expecting the next part to reveal something supernatural, aliens, curses, cover-ups involving creatures nobody can explain, stay with us. Because what investigators and journalists have actually uncovered is stranger than fiction, in a completely different way. Subscribe now, because it only gets more unbelievable from here. Secrecy is a vacuum, and people will always fill a vacuum with a story. Pine Gap is the best example. Because the Australian and American governments have spent over 50 years declining to fully explain what happens inside those white domes, the base has earned a nickname: Australia's Area 51. Podcasts, documentaries, and online forums have floated theories that Pine Gap houses recovered alien technology, that its antennas are aimed at extraterrestrial signals rather than satellites, and that the nearby desert town of Wycliffe Well, a genuine hotspot for reported UFO sightings since the 1940s, is somehow connected to whatever is happening underground. It makes for compelling internet content. It is not, however, what the evidence shows. Declassified agreements, court records, and decades of reporting converge on a far more grounded explanation. Pine Gap is a signals intelligence station, jointly operated by Australian and American agencies, that intercepts satellite communications and helps track missile launches and military movements across a large portion of the globe. It has also been reported in connection with drone strike targeting Sirius, and seriously controversial, but not extraterrestrial. The secrecy exists because the work is classified, not because anything otherworldly is being hidden. A similar pattern plays out at the nuclear sites. Online speculation loves to imagine mutated wildlife stalking Maralinga or the Montebello Islands, twisted by radiation into something new. Decades of government radiation monitoring tell a far less cinematic story. Elevated contamination confined to small, specific, well-mapped zones, not a wasteland, not a breeding ground for monsters, just measurable, lingering plutonium behaving exactly the way physics predicts it should. Even Cartier Island has its own rumour. Less about monsters and more about mystery-persistent speculation about a hidden, permanent military presence guarding something valuable offshore. In reality, the patrol vessels that pass through the area are almost entirely concerned with border protection and fisheries enforcement, not buried treasure. Strip away the internet folklore, and every one of these 5 places has a paper trail, a treaty, a court case, a royal commission, a government report. None of them needed a conspiracy. The truth, once you actually go looking for it, is disturbing enough on its own. Because here's the part that should actually unsettle you. None of what makes these places dangerous depends on anything supernatural. It's simpler than that, and in some ways worse. Start with the law. Under the Defence Act legislation written in 1952, at the height of Cold War paranoia, anyone who enters a declared prohibited area like Pine Gap without authorisation can be prosecuted as though they had committed an act of national security significance. The maximum penalty is 7 years in prison. Not a fine, not a warning. 7 years for crossing a cattle fence. Then there's the radiation. Plutonium doesn't ask permission to stay. Once it settles into soil, it remains hazardous if inhaled or absorbed through broken skin. For time frames that are difficult to fully comprehend, researchers estimate some contamination at these former test sites could persist for hundreds of thousands of years. That is not a horror movie exaggeration. It's a consequence of the material's own physical half-life. It's why, even after a large-scale cleanup operation in the 1990s and the return of Maralinga's land title to its traditional owners in 2009, certain zones remain permanently restricted, and why visitors to parts of the Montebello Islands are still legally required to limit their time in specific areas to 1 hour a day. And then there's the simplest danger of all, things that never finished exploding. Cartier Island spent roughly 40 years as an active bombing range. When a military range falls out of use, it doesn't mean every weapon detonated the way it was designed to. Unexploded ordnance can sit stable in sand and seabed for generations until something disturbs it. A dropped anchor, a curious footstep. That is precisely why government notices still warn that any metal object found on Cartier Island should never be touched. No ghosts required, no aliens, no ancient curse, just official secrecy, radioactive material with a half-life longer than recorded human history, and unexploded weapons still waiting in the sand. If anything, that is far more frightening than fiction could ever be. What ties these 5 places together isn't mystery for its own sake. It's the collision between power and land. Every one of them shows how a single government decision can echo for generations, through law, through radiation, through grief that took decades to even be acknowledged. The traditional owners who were moved off this land, the activists who walked back onto it, and the scientists still measuring what was left behind together tell a truer story than any legend ever could. If you've heard another story about one of these places, tell us in the comments below. And if you want more of Australia's hidden, dangerous, and deliberately forgotten history, subscribe to Hidden Origins. There's more waiting beneath the surface.